here are the first ladies, and in the case of Mrs. Clinton, their daughter. I beg your pardon. I should say Senator Clinton now. Mrs. Bush and Senator Clinton in Chelsea saying goodbye to Gary Walters. Carl Anthony, talk to us quickly about children in the White House who wrote the book on America's First Families. Tough for the kids to leave?
Usually it's very easy for the kids to leave. The grandchildren out of all the family members are the ones that usually have the most fun and suffer the least. I think it's the hardest on the children, particularly young men, particularly those who are juniors, named after their fathers and the expectations placed on them.
I know when President Wilson's wife left in 1920, forgive my memory, she said the thing she missed most about the White House was the servants. But does the staff miss the personalities?
Well, the staff is really the permanent family. And by the way, that was Lou Hoover who said that. It was Mrs. Edith Wilson in 1921 who began with Mrs. Harding this tradition of the two first ladies following in the car behind the president. That was a tradition, of course, begun by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren in 1837.
Thank you, kind sir. And so they get into the new presidential limousine. It's had a little bit of attention earlier this week, but perhaps as we see it out of the circular driveway on the north side of the White House here, you'll get a glimpse at the license plate and another small example of how things change. President Clinton had put on the new optional Washington, D.C. plate, which said no taxation, no representation, and George W. Bush is now going to go back to the more traditional D.C. license plate, which does not have this political slogan, taxation without representation, on it. But here are the brand new Cadillacs. The Secret Service now owns this territory. This Cadillac is bigger than the last one. It is bigger inside. It is plusher. It undoubtedly has all of the bells and whistles that they have been able to do. It's virtually a luxurious armored vehicle. And as you may recall from President Reagan's administration, I think it was, Sam Donaldson can remind me of this. Sam, as I recall, during the Reagan administration, there was an ability for the president to speak from inside the car, and somewhere there are external speakers.
That's right. Actually, those external speakers began in Lyndon Johnson's time, Peter.
Thank you.
And Lyndon would actually, Mr. Johnson, the president, would actually say, "Hi, y'all, come on to the meeting," as he'd drive down the street, and startled people would wonder, what's that? Where's that coming from? But Ronald Reagan also used it pretty effectively, too.
Well, Sam, there's been some momentous drives these couple of miles, have there not?
Oh, absolutely, Peter. I mean, this is, of course, the last hour of the last day that President Clinton promised he would work in. He's about to come up here and relinquish power. And in this drive, you talked earlier about the fact that Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower had a spat and wouldn't talk to each other in the car. In this drive, the small talk is usually pretty convivial because, for the most part, these transitions of power are very, very friendly. There was one moment, though, in his father's transition that you'll remember, Peter, in his father's inaugural address, when he literally held out his hand to the Democratic leadership and said, "We must work together. We must be a bipartisan country." And later the Democrats bit it off. So we'll see what happens today.
Well, I don't want to put too much of a burden on Henry Graff, one of our historians, but I don't think they've all been friendly. Do I recall Eisenhower?
Well, Eisenhower and Truman were on the outs, and Eisenhower asked Truman on the way up, "Who ordered my son home from Korea?" John Eisenhower, the son, was a colonel in the line in Korea, and he said, "I did," as commander-in-chief. It's too bad that they were on the outs at that moment, because at one point Truman had hoped that Eisenhower would run for president on the Democratic ticket in 1952.
I recall President Eisenhower thought that it was bad for his son's image to have been taken away from active service to come home for the inauguration.
Well, I think he thought that indeed and in fact, young Eisenhower's career had been ruined.
And the Associate Justices of the United States.
Now, I must say that I'm somewhat surprised at what appears to be a lack of people on Pennsylvania Avenue going up, at least. And Lisa Stark, I think, is down there at Freedom Plaza. Lisa, does this have anything to do, with best you can tell, with security, or have we just got a smaller crowd than usual this year? All right, we'll try to ask somebody else that question. But going up Pennsylvania Avenue, perhaps it's the weather, perhaps it's the security. There's an officer of some service, military or police, station every 6 feet. They had blue dots put on the ground last night so they could basically tighten up the place. And I'm not sure how easy it's been for people to get close to Pennsylvania Avenue itself. But that is pretty surprising to see such a limited number of people on the way up. Cokie Roberts, who's in the rotunda, your thoughts on who's arrived to be there?
Well, we've seen the senators, the new cabinet members, and just now the Bush family, all the extended family, the George W. Bush's sisters and brothers, nieces and nephews, and some of the official family, James Baker with the family, Nicholas Brady, who was George Bush's Secretary of the Treasury and a good family friend, going out with them, and huge smiles on the faces of all of these people, Peter. But you know, sitting here in this rotunda, standing here, you really are overwhelmed by the moment. And you've been talking about these transitions, and one of our busts here in the rotunda is of Thomas Jefferson. And you know, we Americans just take it so for granted, this business of transferring power from one president to another, one party to another. But Thomas Jefferson taking power from John Adams, the last time this happened to a father-son team, was the first time that happened, where you had a transfer of power, a peaceful transfer from one government to another. And it was the silent revolution. And it was really something that we are celebrating here today, that this is still the magic of this country, that we can do this. Yes, there was rancor, yes, there was bitterness, but it will happen with one man handing over power to the other, like it or not.
Thanks, Cokie. I want to see if we can hear the crowd. Well, I see and know there it's a little bit hard to pick up precisely who these demonstrators are, but a number of groups came to town. There was a long, very difficult negotiation between the authorities and various people from around the country who wanted their voices to be heard on any number of issues here at the inauguration. Lisa Stark, can you tell me who those people are?
I can, Peter, I can. The motorcade appears to be going by here, and it's being booed by protesters lining this part of Pennsylvania Avenue about 2 blocks from the White House. Protesters far, far outnumber the folks who have come to welcome the president, at least in this location.
But who are they?
The protesters are from all different groups. They're mainly here to protest everything from the death penalty. They're pro-choice. They accuse Bush of racism. They're here to also just protest the way the election came out. The Supreme Court intervening, hail to the thief, one of the signs says out here. So they're for a variety of different causes. We've talked to people who have come down by themselves from all over the East Coast, or have come in groups of hundreds from different cities throughout the East Coast. And they've all gathered here in Freedom Plaza to definitely make their voices known as the motorcade goes by now and as the parade comes by a few hours from now.
Well, it may be that the feelings about the election that we know still exist, the fact that this is an overwhelmingly Democratic city, and the weather, and the uncertainty that this election left in many people's minds, is what has caused a smaller crowd to turn out here on Pennsylvania Avenue. Michelle Martin, who is at the foot of the west side of the Capitol, has no shortage of people. Michelle.
That's true, Peter. I'm afraid we're a little bit farther away from the crowd than we would like to be. The police moved us out because they wanted to make it easy to exit as this crowd is swelling. But there are a lot of teachers here. I wanted to pick up on something Koki said earlier. There are a lot of history and political science teachers here who just came just for the occasion, and they thought this was a great civics lessons, and they talked about the elections every day in their classrooms. In fact, I'd like it, if I can, to introduce you to 3 history teachers from Lexington, Kentucky. Can you see them back there? It's a little hard for me to get to them. And I was telling Peter that you were here because this was such a great civics lessons for your students.
Tremendous civics lessons. Our Constitution at work.
And that you actually had a lot of students in your class who didn't agree about the election. How did you handle those disagreements in the classroom?
Well, we asked them to just voice their opinion, why they agree or disagree. Why they support Al Gore, make sure they can support that, why they supported George W. Bush, just make sure they had good reasonings why they supported who they supported.
And we also have one really little guy here. Who's he?
Jesse.
Hi, Jesse. And why are you here?
My dad took me here.
Who's also a history teacher, Peter. So we've got the full range of visitors here today in a really good mood despite this weather.
Show us the little one again. Is that little fella in the front there?
I'm sorry?
Who was the little fella you were just talking to?
Little Jesse is here with his dad, who is a history teacher, and they're actually hoping to meet the president-elect at some point. Do you want to see him again?
Well, I just think I mean, you were talking about him. We never had a chance to see him. He will never forgive us.
Okay.
He'll never be a viewer.
Jesse, they want to say hi to you again. Say hi again.
Wait, Jesse.
Hi, Jesse. Hi. Okay. That's what we wanted. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michelle. Henry Graff, pick up again for us, if you would, on some of the conversations that have occurred in these couple of miles.
Well, you know, we can't imagine what it's like, the heartbeats of Clinton knowing that in a few minutes he's finished, and Bush knowing that in a few minutes he is it. When Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft rode to the Capitol, the small talk involved Taft telling Wilson that he, Taft, had saved $100,000 during his 4 years as president out of the presidential salary. I'm sure Wilson, who was an impecunious college professor most of his life, was delighted to hear that.
George Stephanopoulos, we have learned in the last couple of days, just by looking at the federal record, that Bill Clinton is going to be fairly well endowed financially as he leaves office. And by the way, that's Senator Strom Thurmond, the Republican from South Carolina. You've seen him in the hearings earlier this week for Senator Ashcroft.
Well, Peter, we're actually going to know more about President Clinton's finances than we know about any other ex-presidents because Mrs. Clinton has been elected to the Senate, which subjects President Clinton to the financial disclosure forms of the Senate. And so what we learned in this last day, though, is the final disclosure of all the gifts that the Clintons have decided to keep over the 8 years. It's worth about $192,000.
George, Bill Clinton has an enormous capacity for small talk under almost any circumstances. You think this will be an easy ride for the two of them?
Oh, I think so. And Peter, what they're probably spending most of the time doing, George W. Bush is probably running his speech through his head, and they're just going to be waving to the crowds as they go by, lighting them up. They can get through this 15 minutes.
Thank you, George. Can think of at least one president in the past who thought the other was cold because he simply looked out the window, and perhaps he was running the speech, as we say. Our coverage will continue as they get closer to Capitol Hill in just a moment.
2001 inauguration. ABC News live coverage will continue in a moment.
What about? Well, we're gonna leave the commercial because this is not something we want to miss. So we'll just abandon the commercial there to watch the arrival at the Law Library entrance on the east side of the Capitol. No other building in the United States so intimately linked with the lives of all the people as this one. They come under a portico here to give them some protection from the weather. And then they enter this place beneath the Statue of Freedom that crowns the dome, which makes this place so astonishingly important to every American and to the millions of people who come here every year. Mr. Clinton, escorted by Senator McConnell and Senator Chris Dodd, the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Inaugural Committee. As they go through, this is not a last opportunity for either man to go through these corridors.